The moment you realize someone has been playing a game you didn't know you were in, that silence that follows is not confusion. It is the beginning of wisdom. Most people live their entire lives reacting to the moves of others without ever learning the rules of the board beneath them. They absorb the damage. They make excuses for the people who caused it. They shrink, and they call that shrinking grace. They endure, and they call that endurance virtue. But somewhere deep inside, a quieter voice has always known the truth that certain people are not confused, not stressed, not having a bad day. They are deliberate, they are calculated, and they have been watching you far longer than you have been watching them. You have felt this before. Maybe it was the colleague who smiled at you in the meeting and then undermined you in the one you were not invited to. Maybe it was the partner who made you feel unstable just long enough for you to depend on their stability. Maybe it was the friend who shared your vulnerabilities with others not out of carelessness, but because information in the wrong hands is always currency. You recognized something was wrong before you had the language for it. Your body knew before your mind caught up. Your stomach tightened at certain laughs. Your chest closed when certain names appeared on your phone. That is not anxiety. That is intelligence. What Niccolo Machiavelli understood 500 years ago, and what very few people are taught to understand today, is that the world contains two kinds of people: those who understand power and those who are shaped by it. He was not celebrating cruelty. He was documenting reality. His work, The Prince, written in 1513, was not a villain's manual. It was a mirror held up to the mechanics of human ambition, manipulation, and survival. He watched rulers rise and fall. He watched loyal men be destroyed and cunning men be rewarded. He watched kindness be weaponized and weakness be exploited, and he wrote it all down not to endorse it, but because pretending it did not exist had never once protected anyone. The psychological concept at the heart of everything Machiavelli observed is what modern researchers now call strategic social cognition, the ability to model another person's intentions, predict their behavior, and respond not emotionally, but architecturally. The people who play dirty are not stronger than you. They are simply further along in understanding one thing, that most people operate from the heart, and a person who operates from the heart in a room full of calculated minds is the most vulnerable person in that room. Not because the heart is wrong, but because it is open, and open without awareness is just another word for exposed. Think of it like this. Imagine walking through a city you have never visited, certain that everyone on the street means well, certain that the maps are accurate, certain that the signs say what they mean. Now imagine someone who has lived in that city their entire life, who knows which streets flood in the rain, which shortcuts are traps, which smiling vendors overcharge the unfamiliar. That is not cynicism. That is topography. Learning the terrain is not the same as becoming the terrain. This is what this conversation is about. Not revenge, not manipulation, not becoming the thing that hurt you. It is about waking up cleanly, calmly, completely to the architecture of influence that has always surrounded you, and learning to move through it with the kind of stillness that cannot be rattled and the kind of awareness that cannot be deceived. If you have ever felt outwitted by someone who seemed to play by a different set of rules, if you have ever walked away from a conversation feeling smaller than when you entered it, if you have ever trusted someone completely and discovered that the trust itself was the strategy, then this is for you. Before we go further, take a moment and ask yourself honestly, have you ever stayed silent in a situation where you knew at your core that silence was costing you something? Drop your answer in the comments. You are not alone, and your answer matters more. Machiavelli's first ruthless rule is one that no one wants to accept, because accepting it requires surrendering a belief that feels essential to being a good person. The belief that, if you are honest and transparent, people will meet you with the same honesty and transparency. He called this the error of the idealist. Not because idealism is foolish, but because applied unconditionally, it becomes a gift handed freely to those who have already decided to take everything you offer and use it against you. The first rule, stripped of its historical gilding, is this: never reveal the full measure of your capabilities or your intentions to anyone who has not yet proven they are on your side. This is not deception. It is discretion. There is a meaningful difference between lying to someone and simply not handing them a map to everything you are. The person who plays dirty does not announce their strategy. They do not tell you they are keeping score. They present warmth while cataloging weakness. They ask questions while building leverage. And the person who answers every question openly, who shares every doubt freely, who mistakes openness for connection, they become the most readable person in the room. Readability, when it is not mutual, is not vulnerability. It is exposure. The second rule Machiavelli observed in those who survived and prevailed even against far more powerful opponents was this: never allow others to define the narrative of who you are. This sounds simple. It is anything but. When someone begins to quietly reshape how others see you through a misplaced word here, a withheld piece of context there, a raised eyebrow at the right moment, they are not attacking you directly. They are editing you. And the edited version of you, if you do not notice it happening, eventually becomes the version that others believe. This is the pattern that feels the most disorienting, because the damage is invisible at first. You notice it in the way a room shifts slightly when you enter. You feel it in the questions people ask that suggest they have been given a certain frame through which to see you, and by the time you realize what has happened, the story has already been told. Machiavelli watched this happen to ministers, generals, and kings. He noted that the most dangerous opponent is never the one who challenges you openly. It is the one who works on your reputation, quietly, patiently, in rooms you are not in. His instruction was precise: control the narrative before someone else fills the silence you leave behind. Speak your value clearly, not defensively, and do it consistently enough that no single voice can override what is already known. The third rule is perhaps the most counterintuitive of all, because it asks you to resist the thing that feels most natural when someone is playing dirty: the desire to react immediately, emotionally, and visibly. Machiavelli wrote that a ruler who shows every emotion is a ruler who can be steered. Emotion, when displayed on command, becomes a control panel. The person who can make you angry has discovered the button. The person who can make you anxious holds a key. The person who can make you desperate, who can make you come to them, has already won the negotiation before it has begun. This is not about suppression. It is not about becoming cold or unfeeling. It is about the profound power of choosing when and to whom your interior world is visible. There is a kind of calm that is not emptiness. It is a fullness so complete that nothing rattling from the outside can disturb the arrangement within. People who have been conditioned by difficult relationships often develop an almost involuntary expressiveness, every thought visible in the face, every shift in emotion readable in the posture, because for a long time being readable was a survival strategy. It kept the peace, it signaled safety, it de-escalated someone else's volatility. But in a world where not everyone deserves that level of access, that expressiveness becomes the exact thing that others learn to navigate against you. Reclaiming stillness is not a defense mechanism. It is a form of dignity. The metaphor that feels right here is this: imagine a chess piece that glows whenever it is under threat. Now, imagine every player in the room simply waits for the glow. That is not a game you can win. The most powerful move is to stop glowing, not because the threat is gone, but because you have learned to think several moves ahead without your face giving any of it away. By the time Machiavelli reached the fourth principle in his observations of power, the principle he described as the management of favors and grievances, he had already buried two of the most important conclusions inside it. And most people who read him quickly miss them both. The first is that people remember pain longer than they remember pleasure. The second is that the timing of generosity matters more than its volume. These are not cynical observations. They are deeply human ones. A small wound given at the wrong moment can undo years of goodwill. A single act of genuine support offered at precisely the right time can create a loyalty that outlasts every disagreement that follows. The people who play dirty understand this intuitively. They know that giving you something small when you are desperate creates a debt that feels enormous. They know that withdrawing support at a critical moment creates a fear that lingers long after the moment has passed. They do not operate on a calendar of random kindness. Their gestures are investments, and they are patient with the returns. Understanding this does not require you to become transactional in every relationship. It requires you to become aware, to notice when generosity feels timed, to ask whether a favor arrived before a request, to recognize the difference between someone who gives freely and someone who gives strategically. One of the most documented patterns in Machiavelli's analysis, and one confirmed repeatedly in modern social psychology, is what researchers call reciprocity pressure. The deeply wired human discomfort with feeling indebted. When someone does something for you, the brain registers an imbalance. Most people feel compelled to correct that imbalance. And a person who knows how to create those imbalances deliberately can, over time, steer your behavior without you ever consciously realizing you are being steered. You will find yourself doing things for them not because you want to, but because the alternative, the sensation of owing something unresolved, feels worse than compliance. This is the invisible architecture of manipulation in its most elegant form. Not force, not threats. Just a carefully constructed web of small obligations, offered with warmth, accumulated over time, and called upon quietly when needed. The fifth rule Machiavelli outlined is the one he considered most essential to longevity, and it is the rule that almost no one who is being played dirty is applying for themselves. He called it the consolidation of alliances before conflict, not during it. The person who waits until they are already under attack to seek allies is the person who will be negotiating from a position of visible need, and visible need, in a room of calculating minds, is an invitation to be given less than you require at a price higher than you should accept. The time to build relationships of genuine trust and mutual investment is when you do not need anything. When you show up for others, not because you are managing a crisis, but because the relationship itself matters to you. Machiavelli observed that rulers who had cultivated real loyalty, not purchased loyalty, not coerced loyalty, but the kind that grows from consistent respect and shared interest, survived things that should have destroyed them. And rulers who had only managed people from a distance, who had only connected when they needed something, found themselves alone at exactly the moments when isolation was most dangerous. There is something painful in acknowledging this pattern in your own life, the realization that in periods of conflict or difficulty, the network around you may be thinner than you believed. Not because people do not care, but because the relationship had never been built into something that could carry weight. That recognition is not a judgment. It is simply the beginning of a different way of moving through the world. The sixth rule is quieter than the others, and it is the one that Machiavelli embedded in his observations about what he called the lion and the fox, the complementary natures of force and cunning. He argued that neither alone is sufficient. The person who is only powerful, who relies solely on strength, status, or position, is vulnerable to strategy. The person who is only clever, who relies solely on maneuvering, is vulnerable to direct confrontation. The complete player, the one who cannot be easily undone, is the one who holds both: the willingness to act with full force when necessary, and the intelligence to make that force almost never necessary, because they have already shaped the situation before it reached the point of conflict. The seventh rule, the one Machiavelli saved, in a sense, by threading it through everything else without ever stating it as plainly as the others, is the rule that all the others depend on, without which none of the rest is sustainable or even truly ethical. It is this: know yourself with the same ruthless clarity with which you study your opponents. This sounds familiar. It sounds like something printed on a motivational poster or whispered in a yoga class. But what Machiavelli meant, and what the weight of it actually feels like when you sit with it honestly, is something far less comfortable than affirmation. He meant, know your patterns of self-deception. Know the stories you tell yourself to avoid seeing how you contribute to your own disadvantage. Know the wounds that make you reactive before you are reflective. Know the desires that make you predictable. Know the fears that make you controllable. Because the person who plays dirty has almost certainly already mapped these in you before you have mapped them in yourself. They found the places where your need for approval makes you easier to manage. They found the moments when your discomfort with conflict makes you willing to accept less than you deserve in exchange for the sensation of peace. They found the part of you that would rather maintain a fiction of connection than confront the reality of what the connection actually costs you. And they use these not because they are monsters, though some of them are, but because most people who operate from manipulation learned that behavior somewhere. They learned it in environments where love was conditional, where resources were scarce, where reading the room was survival. That does not excuse the behavior, but understanding its origin removes the mysticism from it. It stops being something done to you by a uniquely powerful force and starts being a recognizable pattern executed by a person with particular habits and specific blind spots of their own. Because here is what Machiavelli also noted: the manipulator, the strategist, the person playing dirty, they have weaknesses too, often profound ones. The person who never allows anyone to see their real self lives in a kind of internal isolation that accumulates its own cost. The person who trusts no one has no one to trust them. The person who turns every relationship into a transaction eventually finds themselves in a world of strangers holding receipts. The validation that matters here is this: if you have spent time in relationships or environments where you felt consistently outmaneuvered, where you questioned your own perceptions, where you left interactions unsure of what had just happened to you, you are not weak, you are not naive, beyond correction. You are most likely a person with a genuine interior, with real empathy, real curiosity, real capacity for connection, and you encountered someone who had learned to use those qualities as entry points. Empathy is not a flaw. It is one of the most sophisticated forms of intelligence the human mind possesses. The problem was never the empathy. The problem was that it operated without an accompanying awareness of when it was being invited in sincerely and when it was being deployed strategically against you. The escalation of this dynamic, when left unaddressed, follows a quiet but recognizable arc. First, the small concessions that feel like generosity. Then, the gradual erosion of trust in your own instincts. Then the slow narrowing of your world as the person who benefits from your confusion becomes more central to it. Then the exhaustion, the bone-deep tiredness of constantly trying to read a situation that was designed to remain unreadable. And finally, the moment that comes for almost everyone who has lived this long enough, a kind of quiet collapse of the previous self, not dramatic. Not a breaking point so much as a slow dissolving of the person you were before all of it began. That collapse, as painful as it is not an ending. It is the precondition for a different quality of beginning. The shift that Machiavelli's seventh rule points toward is not strategic, it is deeply personal. It is the moment you stop trying to fix your understanding of others before you have fixed your understanding of yourself. It is the moment you realize that every time you were manipulated, some part of you was also operating from a script, the script that said you had to earn love, or that conflict would destroy what you had built, or that your discomfort was less important than someone else's comfort. That script was written for a context that no longer exists, and you have been living inside it, long past the moment it stopped being true. There is a version of you that has already done the work, and they are waiting, not impatiently, but with a certain steadiness on the other side of this understanding. They are not harder. They are not colder. They have not become the thing that tried to diminish them. They are simply awake in a way that changes everything about how they move through the world. They walk into rooms and feel the architecture of what is happening without needing to react to every piece of it. They hear what is said, and they also hear what is deliberately left unsaid. They give generously, and they give with awareness. They trust, but they trust what has been earned, not what has been performed. They are kind because they have chosen to be, not because they are afraid of what happens if they are not. Machiavelli, in one of his lesser quoted passages, observed something that reads less like political strategy and more like philosophy. That the greatest power a person can possess is the ability to choose their response in the space between what happens to them and what they do about it. 5 centuries later, Viktor Frankl would articulate almost the same idea inside the walls of a concentration camp, that the final human freedom is the freedom of internal response. Both men arrived at the same place through radically different pain. That convergence is not coincidence. It is the kind of truth that keeps surfacing across time because it is not culturally constructed. It is structural. It is the way human consciousness actually works when it is operating at its most sovereign. The soft guidance that lives inside all 7 of these rules is not a call to become strategic in the way of the people who hurt you. It is a call to become conscious, to build, slowly and with honesty, a relationship with your own patterns that is clearer than the relationship anyone else has to them. To practice, in small daily moments, the art of pausing before responding, not to calculate, but to choose. To invest in relationships where the investment is mutual, not because every relationship must be perfectly balanced, but because your depth deserves to be met with depth. To speak with the kind of clarity that does not leave room for narratives to be written over your silence. To stop explaining yourself to people who have already decided what they believe about you and start reserving that energy for the people who are genuinely trying to understand. There is a specific kind of freedom that arrives when you stop needing to win against the people who play dirty and simply stop being available to be played. It is not a dramatic exit. It is not an announcement. It is a quiet reorientation of where you place your attention, your time, and your interior resources. The person who is relying on your reactivity finds, eventually, that there is nothing to react. The person who is leveraging your need for approval discovers that the need has been quietly retired. The person who is editing your narrative in the rooms you were not in is now simply talking into a space that no longer shapes how you see yourself. This is what Machiavelli meant, beneath all the politics and all the princes, when he wrote about virtue, not virtue in the moral sense, but something closer to vitality. The full exercise of a human being's capacity to shape their own circumstances rather than be shaped entirely by them. The recognition that you are not merely an object in someone else's strategy that you have always been, even in the moments when it felt least true, the author of your own next move. The world will continue to contain people who play dirty. That is not a pessimistic conclusion. It is simply an accurate one. And accurate maps do not make the terrain worse. They make the traveler safer. They make the journey less surprising and therefore less costly. They allow you to spend less energy on the shock of what you find and more energy on the intelligence of how you respond to it. You have already begun by being here, by holding this question, by being willing to sit with ideas that are uncomfortable because they are true. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, the only thing that ever changes anything. The closing thought is this. The person who taught you that vulnerability was weakness may have been the most frightened person you ever met, because only a genuinely frightened person needs the people around them to be confused. You are not confused anymore. And that changes the entire game.